Hello, everyone. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our office investigates complaints of civil rights discrimination, combats human trafficking, ensures equitable language access to county government services, and builds programming to educate on civil rights and social justice and to build community across the diverseness that is our county. With me today as co-host is Dr. Audrey Lau from the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. And together it is our pleasure to welcome you to another episode of Social Justice in Community, our partnership series between our office, the library, and the University of Maryland. This series was brought to us by Dr. Chris Marsh, and it looks at questions like, how does human rights research impact our communities? How does scholarship on human rights violations or issues of social justice have any meaning in our day-to-day lives? And what is being discussed, studied, and thought about in universities today? So today we welcome Nikita Viswasam presenting When Immigration Became Illegal, Race, Labor, and Asian America. Nikita is a PhD student in the Sociology department focusing on social inequalities with research interests in immigration, social determinants of health in the US, urban sociology, qualitative methodologies, mixed methods, and community-engaged participatory research. Prior to being at the University of Maryland, Nikita worked as research staff at the Center for Public Health and Human Rights at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, working on data capacity building, implementation science, and research studies with government, NGO and community stakeholders on HIV health outcomes and determinants in the individual, community, and policy level among marginalized populations globally. Nikita got her Bachelor's of Science in Neuroscience and Global Health at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, and her Master's of Science in Public Health in International Health at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Passionate about making research and data accessible to all, she has also worked as a public health information designer, translating data and technical policy information to visual graphics, and as a printmaking artist. So it is fantastic to have you with us here today, Nikita. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for sharing that, detailed introduction. It was like, I don't want to add too much to that, but I'm going to share a little more about myself. So I'm Nikita Viswasam. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Sociology at University of Maryland, College Park. And then I also want to share my positionality as a researcher. So I identify as a queer and neurodiverse South Asian American woman. I'm the daughter of two South Indian immigrants, and all of these shape my experiences and how I do research. But I also want to acknowledge some of the privileges that I have that also shape my experience. So I have an American passport. I speak a kind of English that people in power can identify with. I didn't grow up upper middle class, but I also didn't grow up working class. So all of these things are things I try and keep in mind, and do this presentation as I go about my work. So just to share before I have my slides up, this talk is going to have a couple different dimensions to it. So part of it is me sharing my research, but also part of it is some storytelling mixed in around some of the details about what I talk about. So I am ready to have the slides up whenever that is good. So can everyone, okay, great. Yes. So when immigration became illegal, race, labor, and Asian America. So to start out, the modern U.S. immigration system is based on the Act of 1965. And this act was hailed as the end of racial discrimination in the U.S. When it came to immigration. And it did increase Asian immigration, but what people don't talk about as much is how this policy actually has a filter that selects for high-scale immigrants from Asia. So, I don't know if this is sort of if I can force interaction from the audience, but if anyone has heard of the term model minority and wants to type in the chat what it means to them, they can go ahead and do so now. And so since the 1960s, Asian Americans have been thought of this model minority in media, public narratives, and by political actors. But this idea of the model minority only sees Asian Americans who are high income and professional class. So in reality, a few scholars have noted that Asian Americans are actually, quote, overrepresented on both ends of the economic spectrum. And so this means, while there are, a lot of them are on the wealthier side, but also there's quite a few of them that are on the poorer side. And those who are low income are actually some of the poorest people in America, but we don't think about that. So this discourse around the model minority doesn't talk about how our immigration policy filters for professional Asian immigrants. And it also misses the fact that before 1965, America had a very, very different view of Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. So I'm here to really look into that. So again, like more background around this is that the first national race-based immigration policy in the US actually excluded Chinese laborers. This was through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So this narrative of like, oh, immigrants are stealing American jobs that we actually still see today, we often associate it with Latinx immigration these days, but this is actually a very, very old narrative. So back then in the 1800s, the early 1900s, this exclusion policy reflected the public's ideas at the time that Chinese laborers were a threat to the health of American labor, which can be read as like white labor, and also to a threat to the physical health, the moral health, and the political health of Americans. And Erica Lee talks about this more in her book, which is a really awesome book I recommend, called The History of Asian America. So given this backdrop, what is my research about? So I'm setting out to answer the question, like, how did Asian labor inform the US state logic that set the conditions of illegal immigration, like legal and illegal immigration today? And how does this reflect processes of racialization? Okay. So I'm using a few different theoretical frameworks to think about this work. One of them is critical race theory, which has a few components to it, but what I want to focus on is Bonilla Silva's concept of the US as a racialized social system. So he was saying like racism is not just about individual acts and behaviors, but rather is ingrained in our entire social structure, of our country, and that these social structures, mechanisms, practices, and social relations produce and reproduce racial inequality. Another one I'm using is Kimberly Crenshaw's work, as well as like other scholars who have built on this, thinking about the U.S. legal system as a racializing force in itself, and that laws help to create race. So a couple other things I am thinking about as well is Claire Kim's concept of racial triangulation. So she was arguing that Asian Americans are racially triangulated between Black folks and white folks. She was looking at the 19th century as well as the 1960s, and she said this triangulation was happening specifically by white decision makers and opinion makers. And then finally, I want to think about policy as genealogical. So current policy was not built in a vacuum, but on a foundation of past policies that can be traced and linked, along a timeline. So some of the work around these concepts that I want to draw from is also work by Lisa Lowe and Wendy Cheng, who talk about Asian race as constructed by British colonialism as like an intermediary labor class, and how they positioned Asians as like a free labor, quote, in contrast to Black enslaved labor. So as you know, like the British was a big part of the slave trade for centuries until they abolished slavery in their colonies in the 1830s. But after that, they were like, well, we still have plantations and we still have these goods that we want to produce in our economy for profit, and we still want cheap labor. So they used Chinese and Indian indenture contracts to fill plantations in the Caribbean, work in South Africa and other places. And these indentured folks were called coolies. And it became like another form of labor exploitation. So what I did was a qualitative content analysis using archival records of US policies. So some of these records include policies that were approved, congressional hearings and testimonies, subcommittee, Congress hearings and reports, and then related agency reports. For example, the Immigration Commission. And these are data sources I found mainly through records of the Library of Congress and the National Archives. So I'm actually going to read out this quote because I want to, this comment because I want to. So for me, model minority meant not receiving attention or concern in educational settings. As an educator now, I notice the quiet, non-disruptive students don't receive the help they need. Thank you for that. Super interesting. I agree. Okay, so why should I do this? Like, what am I contributing with my research? So I would say, this work is contributing a class analysis to immigration policy. I really want to break down the idea of Asian folks as an upper middle class model minority. And as this person said, it's sort of like model minority means they're the successful minorities, which is implying, that there's an unsuccessful minority. And who does that serve as a narrative, So I want to separate different class experiences and what this says about the intertangling of race and class in America. And for scholars who have studied early immigration and Asian migration, knowing early Asian exclusion isn't new, but what I'm doing is to try and see if and how immigration policy before 1965 is actually connected to post-1965 immigration policy, because this is often assumed to be two separate periods of immigration laws. And then finally, I'm interested in thinking about how the US immigration system may be a racializing force and how we think about the Asian race in America. So this is still a work in progress, but I wanted to share the results that I have with you so far. And so one of the ways I'm going to do that is this like tic-tac-toe type chart that's kind of talking, going through some of the time periods and then looking at Chinese laborers, Indian laborers, and Japanese laborers and how they were looked at, who became illegal and when. So to start, I am looking at the 1860s. So 1863 was the year of entry of Chinese laborers to build the Pacific Railroad. This was happening in the newly acquired Western territory of the US that used to be Mexico. Like this was happening in the mid 1800s. And interestingly, this was the same year of emancipation of slavery for Black Americans. So I want you to hold on to that. So part of this, Chinese labor, there was like the stratification of labor by employers. People have talked about how Chinese railroad workers were actually given the most dangerous jobs. So that's also something I want you to hold in mind. So what you're seeing in this diagram is that the dark circle is showing that Chinese folks were present, at this time in the States. Indian and Japanese laborers were not yet around. So that's what the empty circles mean. So in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibits Chinese laborers. And this is key, right? They didn't say all Chinese people are banned. They specifically said Chinese working class laborers are banned. And another key point is that there were special exceptions made to this. And the exceptions were people from certain professional classes. So again, like excluding working class people and allowing as an exception, like certain professional classes of people from Asia, from China specifically. Yes. So as we go to this next time period, which is 1880 to 1917, this is the period in which Chinese laborers were banned. So that's what the X is. Those who were in the country, who were Chinese, were actually required to possess registration certificates that show that they are in the country lawfully. And again, Erica Lee, she calls these certificates precursors to today's green cards. So green cards are what show like state officials and everyone that you are a lawful permanent resident of the U.S. And if anyone wants to hear or talk more about those different designations, let me know. So there's that link between then and now, which I think is really interesting. And sort of like green cards of today, it seems, can be actually traced back to this time in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, where specifically Chinese people were required to hold these certificates as a condition of like saying they're like legally allowed in the country. And Erica Lee also emphasizes that, because Chinese folks in America were the first immigrants to be excluded, they were also the nation's first undocumented immigrants. Because there was also then, after this policy was passed, like undocumented immigration of Chinese folks during this time. So in the early 1900s, Indian laborers migrated and took industrial positions in America and Canada, and especially the Pacific Northwest area. Japanese immigration also took place in the early 1900s. And some of you may have heard of the Bellingham riots. They're basically the same approach that white laborers took to Chinese laborers in terms of seeing them as labor competition and the agents of wage depression and basically bringing down like standard of living. All of these things were now then targeted towards Indian laborers. So in this slide, I have a couple different images up. These images are from media articles that were written between 1906 and 1911, and I'm just going to read out some of these titles to you. So, The Hindu, the newest immigration problem. Pacific Coast states are suddenly awakening to a new immigration problem in the rapidly increasing influx of Hindus, which is what Indian laborers, folks were called at the time. Another one is Gifts of Famine, invasion of Sikhs from the Punjab. And they actually reference like the anti-Hindu riots that happened in Washington by white laborers. And then finally, we have We, a Dusky Peril, Hindu hordes invading the state. And you have some imagery there on that. So some of these things involved journalists talking about things that they were seeing as racial traits. So saying stuff like, oh, these laborers, they accept low wages because of the low standard of living they have. They live in filthy housing conditions. And that was sort of really like the big reasons why white laborers opposed them. And they saw them as people who were driving down white wages as well. And, what was really interesting about this, as well as like what was happening with Chinese laborers in the late 1800s, is that thinking about what else was happening in the country at the time during that time period, right? It's because 1860s to like early 1900s, that was also Reconstruction era. There was also white labor opposition to free Black workers in the North, and W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this in his book, Black Reconstruction in America. And he actually talks about this process of exclusion that was happening, which is very similar to the same types of exclusion, the same types of arguments that were being applied to Chinese and now Indian workers in the West. So also what happened is that there were some really early state laws in the books in California that was like basically taxing Chinese workers, then banning them. And then there was this process of like the California Supreme Court saying, you can't have these bans. And so what happened is that white working class laborers started petitioning US Congress, like National Congress, to be like, you need to do something about this. And so that's when the Chinese Exclusion happened Act, and the Act happened in 1882. And then again, this process was happening again with Indian laborers, and there were hearings in Congress in 1914 about Hindu immigration. So I am going to read out an excerpt by a Congress member from one of those from this hearing specifically. So what he said was, "What is known as the high-class Hindu is a Caucasian, but I have heard it said that the so-called coolie laborers, what might be called the common laborers of India, are not of the same race, that they are sort of a mongrel mixture, possibly part Caucasian and part Mongolian." So to me, first of all, this is like nutty, right? But what this congressperson is trying to do, as I see it, is they're trying to assign race to Indians based on class. So what you can see here is that they're also trying to tie them racially to the Chinese. Chinese at the time were classified like by race scientists as Mongolian. So they're sort of trying to make this argument that like, okay, like upper middle class, upper class Indian people, they're basically white. They're Aryan, they're Caucasian, they're sort of like all the same. They're like us, that's not who we're talking about. What we have a problem with is lower class laborers, working class laborers, and trying to make this argument that they are of a different race. And because, specifically there was a policy precedent for race-based exclusion of immigrants. And so that's how I saw this. It's like them building a basis for immigration exclusion on racial grounds that has this class element to it. So next on that, after these 1914 hearings, there was the Immigration Act of 1917. And what this act basically did is they took a map and they drew boundaries that said, okay, all of this part of Asia, any laborers from here are banned from entering the US. And so, this basically like meant that Indian laborers were now no longer allowed from the US. And sort of like, I'm starting to see this as a process of like, okay, when someone becomes labor competition, they get rolled into this category of Asian now. It's like before they were just Chinese and Indian, Japanese, but now it's sort of like I'm starting to see this as like, okay, this is when the Asian race is just kind of like really kind of starting to form. What's interesting about this is that Japanese laborers at the time were not included in this. So the reason for that is that instead of that, there was a gentleman's agreement in place between the governments of Japan and the US, where the US was basically trying to be diplomatic, and they're saying like, okay, instead of us making a law that bans laborers from your country to come over, which makes you look bad, you should agree to not let laborers exit your country. And Japan was like, okay, sure. And so there was a gentleman's agreement in place, so Japan was not included in that 1917 Act. But this also, laborers from Japan who were in the US still ended up becoming an issue. Like the same thing that was happening with Chinese laborers and Indian laborers are now happening with Japanese laborers. And, this is happening, as you can see with the X's, like as soon as one group of people is banned, that absence then sort of like enabled this other group to come, and then they're seen as labor competition, and then they're banned. And so now the same thing is happening with the Japanese. So in 1924, there was actually another Immigration Act passed. And before that, there were Congress hearings held about immigration. And this is a quote from someone that was testifying in that hearing. So this is what this person said. "When you make that odd job work, the work of an alien, the work of a Black person, the work of a Jap, then the American will not work at it. He will not do the work if it is recognized as the work of some certain class of people." So this I found was particularly interesting. As I mentioned before, like in the absence of Chinese and Indian laborers, Japanese became like targeted by white working class people. as like the vilified labor competition, and then there were clear class distinctions made. And what's interesting about this quote is sort of like really showing that white laborers refuse to do the same sorts of jobs that other Asian folks, specifically Japanese in this instance, as well as they also reference like Black Americans. They refused to do them because it lowered their class status. So there's like, you can see this intertangling of like race and class and what this is. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, so now we get to 1965. So before that, though, so specifically what the 1924 Immigration Act does is that it establishes a quota system based on national origin. And what's interesting is that they specifically went way back and picked the census from 1890 to base these quotas on, and it excluded Japanese folks as well as like, you know, basically like Asian countries just didn't get quotas; they're still excluded. And throughout all of this, again, like once again, there were special exceptions for professional class individuals from Asia. So now we get to 1965. As you know, this was really around the time of the civil rights movement. There were these talks about these laws that should be passed that is banning racial discrimination. So that language is also informing like the hearings and the laws that are happening here. But what's interesting is how people are talking about labor and immigration during this period. So some of the things that I found in the testimonies for, you know, this 1965 immigration hearings before the next law was passed was they upheld concerns of unskilled labor competition. So that did not change. There were also these concerns about overpopulation. And what's interesting about the timing of these overpopulation concerns, you know, it's reflective of a larger global conversation about population growth and overpopulation in these countries, and we need to limit populations because there's limited resources. But for me, the timing of this is suspicious because these overpopulation narratives in the late 60s and in the 70s happened after colonized countries gained independence from the colonizing countries, which I think is just interesting. So some of the things that were said in these congressional hearings were, I'm just going to read out this quote. So to the extent it would have any labor impact at all, it would probably have the impact of increasing employment in the US. So they're talking about the proposed 1965 law. And they're actually responding to a congressperson who's saying, you know, I'm concerned about what this law will do to our unskilled and skilled workforce in the country and, you know, putting in competition with them. So they're saying, you know, the way that we're setting it up, we want to focus on people who will increase employment. So these are highly skilled people possessing skills not available within the US. And that is how you get first preference immigrants. If you go into the other categories, you find for every person coming in who would seek a job, there would be 3 who would not be in the laboring force. If you have 3 people coming in, then you have 3 consumers and 1 worker. So this is interesting because it's saying like, okay, we're designing this policy to focus on high skilled folks, basically like wherever there's a labor shortage, like those are the folks we're interested in bringing in. But also like we are also selecting for people who we think will increase, like, you know, create jobs in the country and also be consumers in the American economy. So I really want to highlight that. And so what happened is that the 1965 Immigration Act abolished the quota system that was happening previously. But what they did instead is establish a skill preference system. So saying like, okay, like we have these different tiers and sort of like this is our highest preference or strongest preference or stuff for people who have these skills, and then so on and so forth. And it also included more family reunification opportunities. So family of American citizens had opportunities to sort of bring direct family members to the States. And this was actually intended for family reunification of Southern European and Eastern European people. This was actually not intended for Asian or other countries like family reunification. They didn't actually expect that people would use that to immigrate from these other countries. So the way that I am seeing this is that prior to 1965, there was this de jure, like by law, explicit, So by law, like 1965 is like banning racial discrimination, right? And, you know, compared to pre-1965, where there was explicit racial discrimination, there's a difference between what the actual language of the law says. But the skilled preference system is saying, however, that the Asian working class laborers essentially are excluded. Like, they're not explicitly banned, but it's very unlikely that their immigration applications are accepted because they're considered low skill. So that becomes a form of de facto, exclusion. Like, they're not technically by law banned, but there is the same reality of exclusion that was happening prior. And as I mentioned before, the intent of family reunification was to invite Southern and Eastern Europeans into the US, but the impact was socioeconomically diverse Asian reunification with Asian Americans. Basically those Asian Americans that were around pre-exclusion immigration and sort of like that. Okay, so then we get finally to, our modern immigration system resting on the 1965 Act. What happened in 1990 is that there was another immigration act that basically expanded temporary work visas. And my takeaway from this is saying, like, okay, well, we don't want all of you to become permanent residents, so we'd rather give you temporary status to that's the kind of labor we need. And how temporary work visas work is that individual employers have to sponsor someone from another country so they can enter and take that job. And, key for me is that you are only legally in the country on the condition that you work for that employer specifically. If you want to change jobs, you need to find another employer who can sponsor you. Otherwise, like, if you quit that job, like, you're not legally in the country, your presence in the country is just not legal anymore. And in 2019, half of approximately 1 million temporary visas were issued to folks from Asia, China, and India. So that's sort of like a different kind of precarity that, I'm thinking about when it comes to like the state. Okay, so what does that mean? How would I interpret some of these findings? Okay, so we're seeing that each Asian group experienced a trajectory of being seen as labor competition and excluded via being racialized differently based on class distinctions. And there are different actors in part of this racialization, right? So there's the employers who chose to pay Asian laborers lower wages than white laborers. There was white workers who, for them, like, to be classed is to be raced. And that's, like, I think a really interesting point to make around that, and part of the opposition that was happening. And then there were also policy actors who, based on their constituent concerns, like, they responded to this, with white labor opposition and fear of white wage depression. And they also were playing a role in the racialization of Asian people. I'm also arguing that through this, like, we can see, I would say that immigration policy was a racializing force, it codified into law, like the writing of certain characteristics related to labor and class into the Asian race for each Asian group. And then after this, it was because of this labor competition, opposition ideas that created the Pan-Asian race category post-1917. That's what I would argue. And I don't think, that you can think about this without also thinking about the context in which it was happening, where free Black Americans were also being seen as labor competition and excluded by white workers, as Du Bois documented. Yeah. So genealogically, I would say, like, the U.S. immigration system was founded on excluding the Asian working class, and mostly it's exceptions to this. Some exceptions would be Southeast Asian refugees who were, given green cards during the 70s and the 80s, and specifically from countries where the U.S. had military interventions, against communism. There are also certain cases of temporary H-1B workers. And then, as I mentioned before, there are those who entered through family reunification policies, which, again, was completely not intent. Like, Congress did not intend for this many Asian folks to immigrate via family reunification. It was not expected. So it is an impact of the law, but it was not the intent of the law. It's not, wasn't part of the intended state logic. So all to say, here's my takeaway. So I want you to think about this every time you hear model minority, or every time you hear that, like, Asian Americans, they're really successful and it's because of their culture. But no, it's like, you need to know that there is a filter by policy of who is legally allowed to be in the US, and it's often professional class people. And you can see that traced throughout history. And so scholars have argued that this idea, the idea of the model minority, is a really useful tool for politicians in justifying why we shouldn't have social spending or social investment in Black and brown people in America. If Asians can make it without handouts, like, why can't they? But this is, I'm saying, like, don't believe this narrative, through this work. My takeaway to Asian Americans who are upper middle class is, like, you have the privilege of being here, but for real solidarity with Black and brown folks, you need to be willing to betray your class status. And I'm channeling Vijay Prashad, as I'm saying this. And for everyone else, like, I would say, like, don't let people pit y'all against each other. Having coalitions across race and across class is important for building power against systems of oppression. So that is my talk. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to send references to anyone who wants it, and I'm happy to take questions and comments and reactions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. I do have actually a question that I want, speaking of references, and we have a librarian with us, so I know for a fact Audrey will be able to Google this and get it in the chat faster than I can. But you mentioned the book by Erica Lee kind of early in your presentation, then you referenced her again. Could you just give us the name of that book again? And we're going to put a link to that in the comments for people watching.
Yeah, so I'm just Googling this quickly just so I can get it correct. But the book is called The Making of Asian America.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Because that was one that I was like, immediately I went to Google and I didn't get the name quite quickly enough. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
One of the questions, I have a lot of questions. I took like a full page of notes over here. We were talking. It was a great presentation. So thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things I was wondering is just, can you take us through how you came to this, to settle on this as a research topic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So before this, I became really interested in how the immigration system and the welfare system in the US intersects. What are the links between the two, especially when it comes to like policy logic and state logic. And so that kind of basically took me into thinking about, okay, like, in order to understand the link between immigration policy in America and welfare policy in America, you need to understand the link between race and labor. And that kind of led me to this idea of, like, you cannot think about the racialization of Asian Americans without also thinking about the racialization of Black Americans. That all these things are tied to labor and class in America. So that was sort of like my arrival at here. And so, especially after reading Erica Lee's work, was really interested in some of this early work, and just in general, like, me just like raging against the model minority, which is the stereotype that like Asian people are just really successful, in America, and their high education, all of that. And it's sort of like, no, there's this total erasure of the Asian working class. And also, as you can see through policy, like, they're just not allowed into the country. And like, how did that come to be? And so that was definitely a reasoning for why I got into this work.
That's great. I'm really interested by that. And like I appreciate what you've done and what you are doing and really looking at the class distinctions and how, like, because I hadn't realized with the China, so I'm not from the United States. So I feel like I have to say that to kind of excuse some of my ignorance, but also I'll just allow that I'm ignorant. And I was not aware that in the Chinese Exclusion Act that there was that some people were that there were exceptions to that, actually, based on profession. I had not known that until just now. So I'd like really appreciate you illuminating this for all of us who are watching right now.
Yeah, I was also really surprised to learn that, and I started to see that it was like a pattern, and so that was something that I'm just like, okay, this is a key finding for me, and kind of like really links, like, today we see upper middle class migration, but it's sort of like, that's not just today. It's sort of like it's like a through line in history. Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know if you want me to take a question or
go for it. Yeah.
No, I was just kind of curious. You talked a little bit about how you came about studying this. I'm just curious if you did talk about how your personal life and your person influenced your. So is there a story? Do you have a story? Because I know my family came over in that early Eastern European, what I call an opening that closed very quickly. And I think it's as we get into higher education, as the years go by, we start trying to figure out, how we were lucky, to get into, this little window that was offered to us. So I just wasn't sure if you had a personal story, or if you just kind of happened upon this as you were, going through your educational experience.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So I think I like to kind of think about my personal experiences in the context of history and like now, also policy based on my work. And so my parents immigrated in 1996. 1996 was not only the year that was just like the highest number of immigration stats in America at the time. This was during the time of like tech and sort of like, and my dad, he had the foresight to get his degree in computer engineering. He could get a degree, number one, and he got it in computer engineering. And so that's how he got a visa to the States, basically. And there are even family members I have today who are just sort of like have been denied visas to America. And those who were gotten visas are all like, they're in computers. And that's how they basically got a visa to the States even today. And so 1996, like, not only was it like the highest number of like, immigrants coming to the States, but it was also the year people would know where major welfare reform happened. And it was the first welfare policy that basically said that citizenship is now a condition of receiving certain public assistance benefits, like because there was not that condition before. So that same year was the year that like basically immigrants were barred from public assistance. If you didn't have a certain status, like, you just like could not get federal public assistance. And so it's sort of like, I grew up sort of like more on a middle class setting. My parents got divorced, like my mom struggles with mental illness. Like I just had a very sort of experience that is a little bit different from other Asian Americans. And I think that or Indian Americans specifically, but part of that is the reason that like people who are allowed to become Indian Americans are often are upper middle class. And so how does that then affect how we see Indian Americans in this country? And it made me question like, okay, like why don't I seem to get along with some people that I should consider my group? But then once I started to realize that, oh, maybe there are class differences in here, and people with different class experiences will have different, ways to kind of approach these things. And so it's sort of like, those are some of the things that I was thinking about that kind of like took me here. And also, we have time, so I'll talk about this. I actually sort of stumbled onto this because I was first really interested in the COVID-19 experiences of Asian Americans. And what I found out is that really early on, like the first year of the pandemic, there was like disproportionate impact of COVID-19 and severe COVID-19 on certain groups of Asian Americans. And there were studies that showed like there's delayed care presentation, like certain groups of Asian folks are just not going to the hospital when they should be. And all of these things are affecting, their health outcomes. And sort of like this was happening during the time of Trump and like a massively anti-immigration policy climate. There was like the proposed expansion of the public charge rule with basically banned even more services, like banned immigrants from accessing even more services. And sort of like, how does this anti-immigration policy climate just sort of just like bear down on immigrants and how they behave and navigate their day-to-day life and sort of things like that. So it made me wonder what that had to do with the way that people sought care and sort of like that was out in public. And that kind of just like led me eventually down to here.
I think that's a great story. I think it's I think you did a really great job of tracing that immigration policy across time. It's something that those of us who study early 19th, 20th century history, which is where my background is, you don't always put the pieces together. And when you start putting those pieces together for people, it's kind of hard to deny the racism and the xenophobia that is actually more an American tradition, if you will, than maybe our give us your poor, you're tired, you're hungry. Which is, again, it depends on which coast you came to. And, there's a difference between Angel Island and Ellis Island. And it's a story that, like I said, it's taken a while to tell because, a lot of early immigrants to this country, and even as we've gone through the 19th and 20th century, it takes us a while to get up into those academia circles to tell the stories, to shine the light on these policies, and to say, okay, you are the USA, but this is, you know, people want to come here, but this is actually how people, it's a struggle. Every single group that has come to this country has struggled. And I just love how you really put that out there. It's really great.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Have you been surprised by what you've been finding in your research?
That's a great question. I guess in some ways I'm not surprised at the racism and classism, but it is new to be able to see all the ways, little ways and the big ways that this has been working. And, you know, I was a little bit surprised at, like, when I think of, like, when we think of America today, even me, I'm just like, we're progressive, like, it's modern, you know, the immigration system is, you know, but in reality, like, a lot of people, my friends struggle with it. And I didn't realize how it's not just that I knew it was classist, right? Like, I knew immigration policy is classist, but this kind of helped me really tease out, like, and through being classist, it's also racist because of the way that race and class are sort of, like, constituted mutually in America. And, you know, I'm not the first person to think about that, but it's sort of like, hopefully, like, people don't pay that much attention to Asian Americans in certain types of research or certain sub areas of research because of the whole model minority thing. And this is trying to, like, bring out, like, no, they're like, Asian Americans have been around for a long time, like 1800s, maybe even earlier than that. They're a part of the fabric of this country, but not only that, they're a fabric of our policy, you know, our policy timeline, and sort of like why we have some of the policies we have today. So yeah, like, I think there were some surprising things, and there are other things that are sort of like, at the end of the day, what it means is not that surprising to me.
Sorry, Audrey, can I go again? So okay. So one of the hard things about having co-hosts is when we got, like, a wonderful, interesting speaker, it's always like a debate about who gets to keep asking questions. One of the things that you talked about in your presentation, and it was you had this section where you had highlighted the different years and immigrants from China, Japan, and India. In that section where you were talking about that, one of the things that you talked about was this creation of the green card system, or the system of different people needing sort of different certificates. And you said that, you know, you see that sort of carrying through now in our sort of contemporary green card system. Can you talk more about that? And I'm sure I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly, but I hope you know what I'm referring to.
Yeah. So what I have learned about this so far is, again, through Erica Lee. So, and then, okay, so some of the early stuff is sort of like, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, not only did it ban, like, Chinese laborers, but it also said, of those who are in the country, because, like, you know, people who had already entered the country, they were allowed to stay. But them staying, like, they all needed to carry around this certificate that said, like, I am in the country legally, you know. And it was only Chinese people who needed to carry that. Like, white people didn't need to carry that. And Erica Lee called it, like, the precursor to today's green card. So when we think of documentation and identification in the U.S. today, like, when we even think of the passport and, like, permanent residency, that documentation needs to be there to kind of show, like, okay, I'm legally allowed into the country. And if someone tries to fly in and they don't have the documentation, they're not allowed into the country. And so, you know, it makes me want to think about how some of these other parts of our immigration system, like the green card, are also tied to, like, early Asian exclusion and some of, like, the processes around identification, like the bureaucratic processes that started there and is now here where we are today. Another interesting thing also that Erica Lee talked about is the fact that I think it was in the early 1900s where war brides and people who were kind of the brides who were kind of immigrating over to be the wives of people, like, whether they were Asian or other nationalities in the States, they got very specific interview questions during their immigration interview when they were, you know, through Angel Island. So, and these were very difficult questions. It was like, how many rooms do you have in your house? Draw a map of your village. And it's like, they would be asking like lots and lots of questions. And part of it was sort of like this deterrence, right? But what I found really interesting when I saw that in Erica Lee's book is like, these are very similar to the kinds of immigration interview questions that we ask to people who are interviewing for the marriage green card. So when someone gets married to a U.S. citizen and they decide together that they are going to give their non-American citizen, like to getting them permanent residency in the States, and maybe they don't live in the country, there's certain questions, interview questions that basically immigration officers will ask as part of that process of successfully getting the green card, if they do get the green card, right? And part of it, what they're trying to get at is like, is this marriage a fraud or is this marriage real? And so they'll ask all these detailed questions that are actually very similar to some of these early questions that were happening in the 1900s. And I'm like, oh my God, here's another example of how parts of the immigration system we have today can be traced back to Asian exclusion, in the 1800s and the 1900s.
Yeah, I mean, so I've gone through that process, so I'm familiar with what you were talking about. And it's I was thinking as you were talking, like, I became a citizen in, I should know this. I hope I hope they can't remove it if I can't remember when I became a citizen. I think it was 2021, but I'm just saying COVID is a lie, so I can't remember any year. It was either 2021 or 2022. I became a citizen, and prior to becoming a citizen, and I mean, I look the way I look. I talk the way I talk, and I know how incredibly anxious I felt, especially more recently, being out in public and like, did I have my card? Did I have my paper? Could I show documentation? Like all of this thing, because I never, and I would say that to people, they'd be like, oh, you're being ridiculous. Okay, I may be being ridiculous, but I'm telling you that's how I feel. So if that's how I feel with all of this, you started your presentation with your identity. So if I felt like that with all of this privilege, to realize, what other people are feeling like who are more likely to be picked out on a transportation system to get questioned for absolutely no reason whatsoever, right? And so, but since I have citizenship, like I don't ever, it's not like I walk around with my passport and feel like I need to, I just wander around, and lock myself out of my house and I don't even worry about it. Whereas 2 years ago, I was very, very careful to always have everything with me. So it's interesting to see, like, again, to have this opportunity to kind of see where some of this very entrenched system has come from. I did want to say we have time for audience questions. And with that in mind, we have one. And then Audrey, I'm going to pass it over to you, I promise. So how do you feel about portrayals of the immigrant experience in movies, TV, or other media?
So I think that is super interesting. I really love those shows that get into the nitty gritty of just like the personal lives and the family dynamics and some of the things that they are dealing with. I also think of some portrayals where I'm going to botch this up, but in Hamilton, the musical, yeah. And then it's sort of like, it's like immigrants, we get the job done. But it's sort of like this association of like immigrants as like, yes, hard workers, but also like behind that is also like labor exploitation and this idea that, okay, we're going to hire, I kind of actually tie that to sort of like why Asian folks were targeted by employers to be like, we're going to hire you, and we're also going to pay you lower wages because we can. And so it's sort of like, what role do immigrants play for employers in terms of like, okay, you're someone who has less labor protection. You're someone who cannot access the safety net. What can we do to profit off of you? And what does this then end up doing for people who are just like feeling like they are in competition with immigrants and immigrants are stealing their jobs? So it's sort of like not just about like the work people who have, so it's sort of like, it's not just about people who have these economic insecurities and they're in opposition to immigrants, but also how has that been manufactured? And sort of like how has decisions by employers in the state sort of like created that situation, that created those situations of economic insecurity, like for everyone. And so I feel two ways about it. Like I like some of the portrayals in terms of like, three-dimensional people, but also I don't like this sort of glorification of the American dream and like immigrant as hard workers, because there is labor exploitation behind that. There was something that you had said, Kyla, as well, where I'm trying to remember what it was, but it was really just like the fear. So I am also thinking about this concept of Foucault thinking about governmentality, right? Like the reasoning of the state and like the government gaze. And what I'm really interested in also is like, how do, like, people who are immigrants, people who maybe don't have a precarious legal status in the States, it's not like they're completely like unaware of this government gaze. So I'm really curious about like how does their awareness of that gaze end up changing how the way that they move through the world and how they navigate and how they engage with social service institutions. Because as you said, like even with what you felt like you possessed as privileges, you were still scared, and so like you were aware of that gaze, and what does that end up doing then?
I think I'd like to tag along a little bit on that. You talk a few times in your presentation, and we kind of skip around a little bit. And something that, as a historian, I'm always like looking at the skips. And so a lot of these skips that you have are the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and also how that the economy tends to drive a lot of government decisions as well, and war does a lot of times. It's not it's kind of against our will, or I won't say it's against their will. The federal government does things in order to make things easier. So 1863, you have the emancipation of only the enslaved people who are in the states of rebellion. It takes until how many years later to actually free the rest, and then another 100 years to actually make that something true. So I guess one of the things I'm wondering about your research is how the wars and these periods of economic necessity are kind of, and as well as these pushes for freedom and rights, civil rights movement. Do you see that Asian American experience is like kind of floating, like, or are there gains or there losses? Like, do you see anything there like in those times? So we're gung-ho, we've got war, we need jobs, like, are you seeing anything there in terms of like, is there a mirrored progression, or is it kind of a little different?
So I think that's a really interesting question. I guess the reason I haven't looked into that as much is because there's actually a lot out there about, for example, like World War II, like Japanese internment in the US and things like that. There's been a lot of research around that. And sure. I think there is research around how that then affected, of course, like narratives around Asian Americans. I think the question of progress based on in those areas is really interesting. And yeah, you're right. I did sort of like skip those places because it's okay. Kind of, I was very much like following like, okay, where were the immigration related policies? Right. But I think what would be interesting is sort of like having that immigration policy timeline and overlaying with these other periods in history and these other things that were happening to kind of like, as you said, like times of economic downturn and what that says about why certain things happened and how people saw certain things and stuff like that. The civil rights movement, this is something I'm really fascinated by, especially like in terms of like how the government has responded to this. And also like, multiple scholars have said, as I mentioned before, that like, the model minority as an idea is like a great tool for politicians to be like, you guys who are protesting about about all the structural racism and historical disinvestment that you've experienced, like with successful Asians over here, like this just goes to show that you're not working hard enough, and therefore we don't need to invest in social spending for you. Like it's not, and that's like this the narrative of like the deserving and the undeserving poor, and like this basically the narrative that basically ultimately led to welfare reform was kind of like all wrapped up in this moment. Yeah.
I want to just go back to, well, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to try and squeeze in kind of maybe a big question, which is you talked about the creation and the Pan-Asian race category post-1917. And can we talk a little bit more about that, like in more detail, as much as time allows? I realize it's huge, but I feel like that was kind of so much of what we were heading towards in this presentation. I'd just like to hear more about it.
Yeah, so this is like a leap on my part. I'm just like, it's really interesting that before this, people didn't really talk about the Asian race as a race, right?
Because there's like people from China, people from Japan, people from India, like separate.
Yeah, there'd be like the Indians, the Japanese, the Chinese. There was some sort of like discussion of Oriental, but what was really interesting is that Oriental kind of, I feel like, came about more in the 1900s. It wasn't really a thing in the 1800s, and it made me interested in how part of this change in rhetoric is because of this idea of labor competition that was happening, or labor opposition. Sort of like this idea that like the people were being racialized differently because they were seen as labor threats. And so because all of these groups were seen as labor threats, they all ended up being grouped into this like Asian race category. And it's sort of like, even today, like this is a census designation, right? Asian, like I have to tick Asian on the census and, forms. But it's sort of like when you talk to a lot of different people who are from Asian countries originally, or that's their heritage, they're just like, this doesn't make sense to me. Like this, I identify maybe as like my ethnic group or like my nationality, but like, we're also different, across different countries and different ethnic groups. Like it has never made sense to kind of like group all these people into one racial category. So I'm like, why did that even come to be? It's like, how did this all become to be like one race category? So it really, for me, is like breaking down like how socially constructed race is, because it's sort of like, if you ask someone like what my racial identity is, they'll be like Asian, but I'm just like, if you ask me what my racial identity is, I'll just be like, it's not a useful concept for me. Identify with my ethnic group, like within my, maybe the country that my parents, but it's sort of like difficult to put all this incredible diversity of like ethnic groups and languages and all of this. Like, does it really make sense to group it into one race? So like so I asked, like, how did that even come to happen? So I'm trying to argue that it was this idea of labor threat in America that created that as like its own race category.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, and so I'm going to ask a couple things. We're really close to time, but if you have papers that we can read, and or some way we can find more work, and we usually have a regular viewer who usually is here with us on Thursdays who says, do you have a book? But she's not here today, so I'm going to ask that question for her. If you don't have a book already, when you get one, will you please let us know, because we would really like to have you back and talk more about that. And if you do have a book, please tell me now.
I would love to. I do not yet have a book. I can let you know when, this is a paper I'm still trying to finish writing, basically. And so, I can keep you posted on sort of when it's out. Right now, it's sort of like, it's really in the conference sort of process right now. But I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me and your interesting questions and just like being engaged and sort of like, this is great for me. So thank you.
Well, it's been wonderful, and I'm serious. I'd love to read it. I'd love to read it when it comes out. So please keep us, Audrey and I, in mind. We'd love to have it. For people who are watching at home, thank you so much for joining us. I do want to let you know that we are doing this every single Thursday from 2 to 3, except for next week. But other than next week, we're going every Thursday from 2 to 3 until through the first week of May, and we really hope that you can join us. It's so wonderful to have such interesting scholars joining us from the University of Maryland, and it's just an amazing series. I also wanted to remind people, if you know, or if you give you news, if you didn't know this already, that we are doing an in-person, the Office of Human Rights is doing an in-person interfaith conversation tonight called Finding Light in the Darkness. And I am putting a link in the chat that I hope will work, or that you're welcome to join us. You just have to register to come. It's at 7:00 at Hydesville Mennonite Church. And I'm also going to ask you to check out the library, pgcmls.info. You can also do pgcmls.info/events, and you can see all the things the library has coming up. They have many events every single day and do all kinds of wonderful work in your community. And you can check us out at civilrights.mypgc.us for the Office of Human Rights. Again, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Audrey. Nikita, was wonderful. I really appreciate your presentation. And we'll see everybody in a couple weeks.